Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise today to speak to Bill C-295, an act to amend the criminal code to make sure that it is a criminal offense if people in long-term care facilities, their owners and managers, fail to provide the necessities of life to residents of the facilities. Mr. Speaker, we have an aging population. 1 in 6 in Canada will be 1 in 4 in just a couple of years. And we all have members of our family, mothers and fathers that are aging. I myself am aging. We're all going to get to long-term care. And the Conservative Party absolutely agrees that we have to protect the most vulnerable. And this bill is a good start in order to make sure that you need to provide the necessities of life. And what I would say is the bill doesn't necessarily go far enough. I'm going to take the theme up of the pyramid of needs. So we know in the pyramid of needs that food and shelter and clothing, and they're at the bottom, and security is at the bottom. And so this bill does address those necessities. We all heard stories of people who were left in their own excrement or didn't have enough water, dehydrated, lack of food during the pandemic. But what about their emotional well-being? And what about their mental well-being, Mr. Speaker? I think there's more that needs to be done here. My own mother died in long-term care, and the children had to choose who was able to go in. And that's not fair, and that's not compassionate. So I think, Mr. Speaker, there's more to be done on the bill. And I would say as well that we saw, even after science showed that those that were vaccinated could get and transmit COVID, the same as the unvaccinated, there were still people that were discriminated against and not allowed to visit their loved ones, even with reasonable accommodation. So, Mr. Speaker, I see that you're not nodding at me. Great, I'll continue in this theme then. Basically, if you think about what happened during the pandemic, I received so many calls at my office from people who either were trapped on one side of the border and couldn't come and visit their loved ones who were dying in long-term care facilities. There was no real compassionate exemption made. I applied many times, but usually the length of time it took to get approval meant the person had died anyways. And how tragic is it when you have somebody who's alone and vulnerable in that place, even if they only have one of the family there. I can remember when my mother died in long-term care that I had to hold up the iPad so that my brother and my sister and all the people that weren't able to come to see her could say goodbye. And after 95 years of a well-lived life, it was very sad. And then there was the whole issue of funerals, where they limited the numbers, people weren't allowed to go to them, and that also was very, very sad. And so, Mr. Speaker, the bill takes a good first step in order to address some of these things. Now, at committee, I was pleased to see that some of the amendments were actually accepted because, the definition of managers was not, specific enough. And we want to make sure that all of the facilities, whether they're private or public, have some kind of standards of care. So that's another opportunity that wasn't addressed here. I think there are differences in standards of care across provinces and across types of facilities. I was lucky that my mother was at Albany Village in Petrolia, and they did a wonderful job of taking care of her, although many times I stood at the window to say hello to her during the pandemic. The other thing that this bill allows is for judges to consider this an aggravating factor in any of the offenses that are involved in, with volunteer activities or with somebody in a position of trust or authority. And I think that is a good thing. I'm very thankful to the member for Vancouver Centre. She is a doctor herself, and we are all aging, and she has brought these concerns forward before this House, and it sounds to me like this is the moment where all of the different parties are agreeing, yes, we need to do something here, it needs to be a criminal offense. But I hope then that it will be an enforceable criminal offense. We have a lot of laws in the country, and we don't spend a lot of time necessarily enforcing those laws. And in this case, it's so important. These are vulnerable people. In many cases, they don't actually if they have dementia or anything like that, they don't have the acumen to fight for themselves. And so we need to be the ones, Mr. Speaker, that put measures in place so that those that are looking out for them are, dealt with. I would say as a woman, this is also a gendered issue. We know that 85% of the people who are in long-term care facilities are women. And we also know that many of the workers and volunteers in these facilities, 86%, are women. And so, we need to provide protections for those that are caring. We need to provide protections for those that are being cared for. And we need to make sure that we're not just meeting the base level of the pyramid, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to emotional needs and mental health needs, we know that isolation caused huge issues during the pandemic, not just among people in long-term care facilities, but even in the general populace. 1 in 5 people ended up with mental health issues coming out of the pandemic. The suicide rate was up immensely, and violence actually was up immensely. 32% for the people in this age demographic of long-term care, and of course we've seen a huge rise in crime across the country, 39% increase. So addressing all of the levels of people's well-being will be important, and this bill doesn't go that far. I would argue that people need in future to learn the lessons that we learned out of the pandemic. It didn't really help when we kept some individuals away from seeing their loved ones and let others in, because at the end of the day, we let 90% of the people do what they wanted, and the 10% that were unvaccinated could not, but the science showed both could transmit COVID. And so at the end of the day, the reasonable accommodations of masking and personal protective equipment would have really, I think, addressed a lot of the loneliness, the agony of watching loved ones die or not being able to get to loved ones that were dying. I think that was very serious. The other thing I would say, Mr. Speaker, is that, the long-term care facilities have been studied and studied and studied. There was a report at Health Committee in 2018 when I was there that talked about standards of care and talked about the number of individuals that you need to have per resident, and that it's not always the same by resident. It matters whether or not the resident has dementia, whether the resident is at a high functioning level or not. And so certainly I think we need to look at the best practices in the country and adopt some kind of minimum standards of care in terms of number of caregivers, standards of care in terms of times. You hear a lot about how many minutes somebody will get of care a day. Clearly, for human beings, we can't just say, well, you've had your 7 minutes for the day, that's it, that's all. I think we need to be more compassionate than that, Mr. Speaker. So while I'm happy to see this bill, I think it's a great first step, I would like to see us go further. I think the government has an opportunity as they reflect on what happened in the pandemic, the violation of people's rights and freedoms, not just those in long-term care facility, but 7 million Canadians that were prevented from leaving their country for 3 years. I think there's a huge opportunity to do a thorough review and to come back with policies that will address people's basic needs and their mental health needs and the emotional supports that they need. Obviously, it's one step at a time, Mr. Speaker, but I'm happy to say that we will support this legislation, and we look forward to doing more things to protect our seniors who are the most vulnerable in society. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.